Greetings. Ethiopia is located on the Horn of Africa and is seldom visited by Western Christians, and even fewer of them travel north to marvel at the ancient churches carved from solid rock. It's mostly a mountainous region where the Blue Nile flows west, then north, down into Egypt, whilst at the other side of the Rift Valley, there's a hot desert bordering onto Somalia. Back in the year 2000, the church where Margaret and I worshipped were helping with an urban development project in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital city. And Sister Jember Teferra was organising a conference and a delegate was needed, so I agreed to go and represent Glenfall Fellowship. At the end of the conference, there was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a tour of Lalibella in northern Ethiopia, famous for its distinctive rock-cut churches, which are a pilgrimage site for Coptic Christians. And Lalibella's churches were carved out of solid rock in the 12th and 13th centuries when Muslims had captured Jerusalem and the king was trying to preserve the Christian faith on the African continent and also give a place for pilgrims to visit. First though, let me set the scene by mentioning a previous slideshow from a similar conference on urban development, which coincided with Epiphany in Addis Ababa. This was a colourful and joyful occasion, and I described it in January 2021. Well, during the next half hour or so, I'd like to take you through various events building up to Lalibella's rock churches. A few moments ago, I mentioned Sister Jember Teferra, who was leading the urban development project. Her husband, Haile Georgis, had been Lord Mayor of Addis Ababa, as well as a cabinet minister until the 1970s when a communist revolution deposed Emperor Haile Selassie. This picture was taken in the mid-1990s when most of the family were reunited in London. Well, as I say, in 1994, Jember had organised a conference which was supported by several international Christian charities. And this picture of people arriving at the airport shows Dr. Ray Baki, who was running a doctoral course in Christian ministry. And by the year 2000, Jember was one of his students. This was in addition to running the urban development project for over 35,000 people in 4 different parts of the city. So it's a miracle really that she was able to manage with all that activity going on. She was a regular visitor to Cheltenham, and here we see Jember with Chris Hughes, our treasurer at that time, and Jember's best friend, Liz Scotland, who was married to our minister, Nigel. And every autumn, Glenfall Fellowship in Charlton Kings hosted a conference for Jember's UK supporters. And you can see there's quite a lot of them, but there was actually nearly 200 people on the list, some of them representing major charities such as WaterAid. Well, by the mid-90s, Jember's husband, Haile Georgis, was needing medical treatment in the UK, and we had the privilege of hosting him for lunch one day. The communist revolution back in the 70s had resulted in being imprisoned for several years, and without a proper diet, he had gone on to develop diabetes. And as you can see from the bandage on his foot, he was in quite a poor way by the mid-90s. And sadly, a few days later, his foot had to be amputated and he died soon afterwards. Almost immediately, their son, Abba, took his own life. I'll say a bit more about that later, but Jember was hit by a double bereavement. She'd had more than her fair share of suffering, but she never lost her faith. And as you may remember from my previous slideshow, she'd written a couple of booklets. And after a year or two, she added a third booklet, The Light Through the Darkness of Grief. And all these little booklets are freely available in the Churn Valley parish churches if you want to pick one up sometime. Glenfall Fellowship continued to support the work in Addis Ababa, and we paid towards this pickup truck. Back then, many of the slum dwellers relied on charcoal for their main heating and cooking. Here we have some ladies doing this filthy job of preparing the charcoal for people to buy. Jember and some of her colleagues had the bright idea that instead of the women having to go out into the forest and bring back the wood to turn into charcoal, they could just get the organic material that was lying around in the streets and turn that into charcoal, which sounded perfectly reasonable. We fished around inside the UK for various experts who could help us with this process. And eventually we hit on a doctor in Oxford, Eric Lamont Gregory, who helped us to develop some equipment that would gather the sweepings up from the street, the banana skins, even the dead dogs, I have to say, and put them into a hopper, and then with some heat and light, be able to turn them into briquettes. Sadly, that project never really developed as we wanted it to. Let's move on now to the interchurch urban concern, which is the reason that I was sent out to Ethiopia. Here we have Jember sat between Nigel and Liz, Scotland. They were always a great support to her. And the trip out to Addis was via Frankfurt with Lufthansa. I think this is Cairo. We touched down there briefly. I was amazed to see that the motorway had been blocked, not by snow like we'd have in the UK, but by a desert storm blowing sand right across, obstructing the highway. Eventually coming into land at Addis Ababa and then into the city, which in the year 2000 was beginning to look fairly prosperous, although it hides a lot of social problems. The population was growing rapidly, and Addis was probably about 3 or 4 million by that time. The annual growth rate of population in Ethiopia was 3%, one of the fastest growing in the whole world. The streets are full of young children wanting to hold hands and being very friendly. Obviously, don't see many white people. I thought this was quite interesting. The Jesus Drugstore. I'm sure it means the pharmacy dedicated to Jesus, but anyways, the Sheraton Hotel had been built around that time, and Jember would sometimes take visitors there to experience an hour or so of the high life before going back to the slums. Also, there were coffee shops. I think this was a legacy of the Italian occupation. That was a nice treat. And of course, coffee has caught on in a big way in the UK in the last 10 or 20 years as well. But what a contrast with the rough sleeping in the streets. Just hard to imagine what it must be like to have such a hovel to go back to. And Jember's heart went out to all those poor people, doing her very best to provide for them in better ways. This is the accommodation that Jember had for myself and a friend, Dave Hatton, who was also from Glenfall Fellowship. She had a little compound of houses and farm buildings. This is the maid who she cared for. And the other person who was resident was the farmer. And there we are in the centre of a big city with a farm dwelling and a very happy cowman indeed. Here we see a typical scene from Addis Ababa in those days with the corrugated iron sheeting everywhere. And many different denominations coming together for this conference in a bid to transform the city, where 90% of the population were living in poverty. And Jember's favourite Bible passage at that time, one that was the theme for the conference, was this from Galatians chapter 2, verse 10. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor. And when you think of the privileged background that Jember had come from, and we ourselves from as Western Christians, it's a sober reminder that we too need to keep remembering the poor and doing what we can to help them. I must say, at the end of the conference, Dave and I were having a meal with the organisers, and they said, it's great that you've travelled all these thousands of miles out here to Addis Ababa to talk to us and support us. But what are you actually doing for the poor in Cheltenham? And there was a long pause because, quite honestly, we weren't doing anything as far as I could recall at that time. And the only reason we were involved with the poor in Ethiopia was because of a personal friendship between Liz Scotland and Jember Teferra. And I've often thought of that and tried to do something about it. Well, one of the first things we did as the conference started was to go on a tour of various Sunday services. And we were just like, like a pub crawl. This was a church crawl where we just popped into the building for 5 or 10 minutes, sampled a Baptist church or a Pentecostal church. In this case, I think it's an Ethiopian Orthodox church, and got a feel for the sort of worship that was going on. Here you can see how people were spilling out onto the street, just couldn't fit everybody in. Wouldn't that be a great problem for us in the Churn Valley if we just couldn't get everybody seated in our buildings? Well, Dr. Ray Backy, who I mentioned earlier, is quite an eminent theologian, and he explained to us some of the differences between the worship in each of the denominations. And of course, the big one, the big difference was between the Western Church based on Rome and the Eastern Church based on Constantinople. The Ethiopian Christians fall under the Coptic branch of Eastern Orthodoxy. And here Ray Backy was explaining to us that it all came down to a big schism in about the 11th century when the churches fell out over whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father or from the Father and the Son. But it's hard to believe that it's caused such division, really, something as what sounds to me is a fairly trivial matter. I'm sure there was a bit of politics in there as well. So here we have the little booklet that was handed out to delegates and the location of the Congress, quite close to the urban development area. Jember had obtained funding for a youth centre to be built, and this was it. This was the centre for our meetings. Some of the prominent church leaders from around the city, and the guy standing up, Greg Valerio, took everybody by surprise by expressing his Christian love in a most remarkable way. He got a bucket of water, got on his hands and knees, and he washed the feet of every one of those church leaders. It took him quite a while, and it was quite a strange atmosphere, but I never forgot what that meant to those people who themselves had poured out their lives serving the urban poor. Jember was quite well organised. She got a little booklet showing the different projects that were coming together for that conference, and you'll recognise some of them, I'm sure. The conference lasted 2 or 3 days, achieved quite a lot. Here we have a meal one evening in one of the local restaurants. Doesn't look particularly appetising to me, but one of the ladies in that picture had been a nurse in Addis Ababa for quite a few years, and she loved injera and wat far more than fish and chips, which would be our staple, our equivalent back in the UK. A bit of Ethiopian dancing to entertain us, and they do a lot with their shoulders. I can't describe it, but you could probably find it on the YouTube if you want to have a look. Some more injera and wat. I tended to go for the bread, really, not being very adventurous, and salad. But salad is risky in that environment because unless it's washed properly, you can pick up a bug. And on one of the trips to Ethiopia, I came back with shigella, a form of dysentery, had to be checked out by the local environmental health officer. Certainly wasn't allowed to mix with other people until it had cleared up. Ethiopia is big on the coffee ceremony. The Ethiopian coffee is very special, really, and it comes out at different times in 3 particular flavors, depending on how long it's brewed for. But I'm not an expert on this thing. Just a few words about the project that Jember was running, which was known as the, wait for it, Integrated Holistic Approach Urban Development Project. And it fell into 3 areas: community development, and you can see there a list of things that she was involved with for these 40,000 people. Health improvement for the community, a number of programs going ahead there. And then the physical upgrading. She particularly liked this quote from Isaiah 58, verse 12. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. And in those days, back in the year 2000, only 46% of the population had access to health facilities, 28% of them had safe drinking water, and only 16% had decent toilet facilities. So this was a marvellous upgrade. Well, after spending some time, a week or so in Addis Ababa, we had the opportunity to fly north for several hundred miles to the Blue Nile's Falls and have a bit of a holiday. It's about 350 miles from Addis Ababa up there to the Blue Nile Falls. And we stayed in a town called Barada. And early in the morning, well, by my standards, sort of 6:30, we set off in a Jeep to go to the river. Some kids along the way, all keen to sell their goods, I think they are. And there's about a 20-minute walk from parking the car to actually get to the waterfall. Here it is. The Blue Nile Falls are about the same size as Niagara, but with probably twice as much water in those days. So there's a permanent mist blowing up from the crashing waves. Rainbow effect. You can just see it there on the right-hand side of the picture. Here's some more of those gourds for sale, and this is my friend Dave Hatton, surrounded by young ladies trying to sell him things. So after that, we set out across Lake Tana, which is that blue blob that you can see there in the centre of the red circle. We're staying in quite a nice hotel, as you can see, fairly modern. Next to Dave Hatton, there's a lady called Gwen, who was on the doctoral course with Jember. And then Jim, who was from Waco in Texas, where you may remember that David Koresh had that cult, which was attacked by the police and set on fire. And then over on the right is Ray Backey, who is of high stature and status. It really got to know the culture before going to speak to them. This is Lake Tana. It's a vast lake, but I would say it's 50 miles long. So it's like going from Cheltenham up to Birmingham, and it's about 30 miles wide. And there on the island, you can see it's about an hour's boat ride away. There's a church, and the church is of particular interest because it's believed to be, by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church anyway, the place where the Ark of the Covenant, which you read about in the Old Testament, was taken for safety. This is a tradition that they have, and it's not exactly supported by the Bible, but it's important for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And so we were able to go across this lake, and here's the sort of reed boats which the locals use. I'm glad we were in a decent boat to get across there, but I had a canoe at that time, which I'd paid £500 for, but these reed boats were going for only 50 pence. It just would have been a problem to get it back on the aeroplane. And you can see how they're bringing timber across from different parts of the lake to turn into charcoal, which would then find its way into Berodar and other towns and cities. I don't know if you can make out, but at the top of that hill there on the island, there's a church, and that's where we're heading towards. So we get onto the dry land, and beyond the boats, you can see several young ladies. And here they are. They spent literally all day going up and down that track, carrying water for the village at the top. I was really challenged by their lifestyle, what a tough time they had of it. I was also challenged by a young man who wanted to know why we were there. Were we just tourists, or were we real pilgrims? And I had a really difficult job convincing him that we were real Christians. And in the end, I satisfied him by launching into the Apostles' Creed, which he seemed to relate to that quite well, and then he backed off. I suppose he was well-meaning. But here's the church that we saw a glimpse of from the boat. And look at that incredible decoration inside there, the wall paintings and murals. St. George features quite strongly in the Ethiopian culture, so that's something we have in common. He's our patron saint in England as well. And obviously the Virgin Mary there holding the baby Jesus. The colours are all very significant. There's a lot that can be read into the pictures, just like we would interpret the stained glass in Gloucester Cathedral. Here's one of the old priests. We always made a point of showing our gratitude by leaving them some coins, or preferably some notes. And at last we come on to Lalibella's rock churches, really high up in the mountains, and fairly basic airport really. For some reason we were waiting for a taxi to come in the heat of the day, and this was the visitor accommodation, which, as you can see, is just a corrugated iron roof. We were there for about an hour, and so we found a football to kick around. And we got onto a taxi that took us up into the village of Lalibella, passing through local villages. And Lalibella's quite unusual in that the tuckles or huts are on 2 levels, as you can see. Welcome, Lalibella, World Heritage Site since 1978. What about that then? That was the first church that we visited, and it's known as the House of St. George, and it's isolated from the other 10 churches in that area, but connected by a system of trenches. And as you can see, it has a remarkable cruciform shape, a different view of it. And just to think that was cut out of solid rock, the rock would have been volcanic ash, which is relatively soft, but must have taken great skill to do that. It's a challenge to us intellectually, isn't it, to think that people in Africa in about the medieval period were able to do such a thing. I think that would have been a challenge for Europeans. And then hollowed out on the inside as well. And there's a baptismal pond, as you can see, with the green algae on it. I presume they clean that out for baptism candidates, or they wouldn't have many takers, would they? Inside, various priests, this one holding a cross, and Lalibella has its own type of crosses. And you can see what looks like a swastika is part of their setup, but that predates Hitler's use of the swastika. It had a different meaning back then. A different church now, centre of pilgrimage. And this just shows the layout of the different rock churches. We started off at number 1 over there, and the blue line is referred to by the locals as the River Jordan. They're actually trying to recreate something of Jerusalem here, because as I said earlier, at that time, the Muslims had captured the real Jerusalem, and the pilgrims weren't able to go there. So to try and give them an alternative and preserve the Christian faith in Africa, the king at that time, King Lalibella, set out to construct this new city. A little bit about each of the churches. First of all, there are two main groups. Those to the north of the River Jordan, starting with number one, that was the House of St. George. Number two is the House of the Cross. Number three is known as the House of Golgotha, Michael. Number four is the House of Mary. Number five is the House of Virgins. And number six, the House of the Saviour of the World. And you can see from the size of it that it's got 5 aisles and is believed to be the largest monolithic church in the world. You can also see that there are various tunnels connecting these churches, and we'll pop down into one in a minute. To the south of the river, we have number 7, which is the House of Emmanuel. Number 8, the House of Mercoros. And several of these interiors are decorated with murals, which may indicate that it was a royal palace. Number 9 is the House of Abbot Limonas. Number 10 is the House of Gabriel Raphael. And number 11, the House of Bread. And again, this one could have been a royal palace. The churches were not constructed in a traditional way, but as I say, hewn out of solid blocks of rock. And from those, they were chiseled out doors, windows, columns, various floors and roofs. Here we are down one of the tunnels I mentioned earlier. And this was a particularly good one. It went for about 100 yards. And then there were some steps that led up into another church, but there were floorboards. And you could see and hear people moving around just a few inches away, but it seemed as though it was taking a bit of a liberty to start lifting up the floorboards and pop up in a new place, so we didn't do that. Not only that, some of the guys weren't all that friendly. Look at this poor guy. I mean, he's been sat there all day long waiting for people to go past. I presume he's been praying, but they're in semi-darkness most of the time. There's an interesting crossover on the left, and Jember told me later that represents Christ at the top with his disciples around him. As I say, this is a World Heritage Site, and some of the church structures are starting to decay, so UNESCO have got a project on the go to protect them. These trenches may have been built originally for fortification. They're totally unguarded. I don't think the National Trust would leave them as open as that. And there's one that can only be reached across this rather precarious looking bridge. Well, it is a unique place and a great privilege to have visited Lalibella. Nearby, there are other rock churches that this one is actually built inside a cave. I would have been interested to visit that one, but ran out of time. And just to show what Lalibella's like at Epiphany, Easter, and other major festivals, when hundreds, thousands literally come from all over to worship. So this is their equivalent, really, I suppose, of Canterbury. We're coming towards the end of this now, and there's just one other place that I'd like to tell you about, and it's the city of Gondar. So that was another quick ride in an aircraft, and we had a very comfortable room, even by Western standards, up above the city, looking out over the surrounding landscape. And there are castles. This one was founded in the 17th century by Emperor, I don't know if I can pronounce this right, Fasalides, and was the home of various emperors. It has a unique architecture blending from different places, and it was inscribed as a World Heritage Site around the same time as Lalibella. just a different view of it. And they haven't always had an easy relationship with the Christians or the Muslims. But one of their stories is that while the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon, which is documented in the Bible, they had a rather close relationship. And she came back to Ethiopia carrying his love child, who became King Menelik. So the little box you can see there is meant to represent what happened between them. As I say, they didn't always have an easy time of it. Some of them remain around Gondar, but in May 1991, the Israeli government airlifted over 14,000 of these Ethiopian Jews within a 36-hour period, and they took them to Israel. That hit the news. This was known as Operation Solomon. And you can see how they have taken out all the seats so they can cram more people in there. In Gondar, known as Debre Beriam Selassie Church, meaning Trinity and Mountain of Light. And it's one of the most famous places of worship in the city of Gondar. And the modest yellow brick walls could give a false impression, because once inside, the visitor is treated to a kaleidoscope display of creativity in murals, wall paintings, and a ceiling that's covered with these angel faces, which I've never seen anywhere else in the world. It's quite breathtaking. There's a representation of the Trinity, as you can see, and Christ on the cross. This must be one of the most beautiful churches in the whole of Ethiopia. There's also a massive, I was going to say swimming pool, but it's really set apart for Epiphany, when they have ceremonies all over the country. And here this will be filled up and the water blessed by the bishop for people to take back to their villages. Before leaving Gondar, we drove past Mother Teresa's school or home for children, the Missionaries of Charity. And I thought it's fantastic that her work had extended beyond India. So then back to Addis, about a 45-minute flight. Addis, as ever, bustling with activity. I should say that at one time, I think during the Italian period, they drove on the right-hand side of the road. And then under British influence, they started driving on the left-hand side of the road. So most of the time, there's confusion around about which side of the road you should be driving on. And it's one of the most risky places in the world to drive. Fortunately, we had pretty good chauffeurs to get us around. Well, that was the trip in the year 2000. Just a few words by way of updates to finish off with. Dave and I were there in April 2000, and by May or June, war had broken out with Eritrea, and they were running short of soldiers, so they were conscripting women to fight against other women. Jember's son, who I mentioned earlier, had taken his life, Abba. I think he was so overcome with grief at losing his father. He had a history of mental illness going back to the time of the Communist Revolution. Jember wrote a little book about Abba to try and help other youngsters who were having mental difficulties. The project symbol, which you'll be familiar with by now, it started to become more sustainable in the long term. And so two subsidiary organisations had been formed, Sabisto and Ahisto, as we call them, to work in the slums with support from overseas. Here's some delivery of food or other goods needed for the elderly care. Remember that I mentioned about the fuel briquettes for charcoal? Well, the man who helped us with that, Eric Lamont Gregory, left the UK. He'd been doing a PhD at Oxford University. He wrote a book called The Ultimate Vanishing Act, and he popped up in 2012 and was a candidate for the United States Senate. I think he was up against 5 other candidates and didn't quite make it. Jember continued to visit Cheltenham. Here she is again with Chris and Liz. They had various speakers each time, served lunch and bought various craft goods. Going back to Lalibella, this is featured recently in one of Ben Fogle's programs, New Lives in the Wild. And here he's met a retired teacher who swapped life in Glasgow for Lalibella. I think she's married to a local and made a great success of her restaurant business. So it's changed out of all recognition. In fact, a BBC article I found recently is suggesting that there's so much tourism now in Lalibella that it's spoiling the rock churches. Addis Ababa itself has become transformed. I'm sure there is still a lot of poverty there, but it looks very much like a Western city. Not that I've been for a while, but you can see a high-level monorail there, which I think was put in quite recently, and the Chinese have built a ring road around the city as well. I find it hard to believe that this is Addis Ababa. Going back to the Blue Nile Falls, this is how they used to look. But today there's a hydroelectric scheme which is diverting 90% of the water, but creating energy for Baradar and some of the other surrounding area. Further down towards the border with Sudan, there's a big new dam, which is not only under construction, I think it's virtually completed. And this is it. Very controversial because the people downstream in Sudan and Egypt feel threatened by this dam. Obviously, they too depend on a good flow of water for their crops and for drinking water as well. So at one time, Egypt was threatening to bomb this dam, but thankfully that's not happened yet, and we hope it continues to work well and generate electricity for the Ethiopians. So it's taken a bit longer than I wanted to, but thank you for sticking with me. I hope you found that interesting, and be happy to share more about this wonderful country and the Christian mission there on some other occasion.